the young troubled mind of Shinji Mikami, where growing up was, as he put, one wrong step, you're almost dead. That strict parenting helped influence Shinji Mikami to create one of the most well-known and highest-selling horror video game franchises of all time.
Biohazard.
Or as most of us know it in the West,
Resident Evil.
Perfect for the spirit of Halloween and all things spooky, I figured what better series to cover than a horror franchise that spans as far back as 1996, with nearly 24 games since then and a couple of movies to boot. But Resident Evil doesn't have an MMO, if you're wondering. Instead, it has a tumultuous relationship with all things multiplayer. There's 4 multiplayer-focused Resident Evil games that are mostly maligned for franchise fans, and with another project on the horizon, uncovering the reasons why the previous multiplayer games failed is all the more important. Resident Evil Outbreak 1 and 2, Operation Raccoon City, and Umbrella Corps, and their inability to garner quite the success expected of the franchise will be the mysteries we solve on this special Halloween episode of Death of a Game. Grab your muscle or bring Leon or Chris's biceps and some trusty ammo. You'll need it for this zombie-infested episode. The story of Resident Evil spans far back, from the junior game designer Shinji Mikami at Capcom in Osaka, Japan in 1990. Shinji Mikami might not have been originally interested in horror, as his first credited success is a Disney movie adaptation platformer, Aladdin. When assisting fellow Capcom developer Tokuro Fujiwara with the original idea of Resident Evil, Fujiwara instead entrusted the series to Shinji Mikami. The rest has truly been history. The zombie horror title Biohazard came out in '96, renamed for its American launch as Resident Evil, first of the series. The cultural impact that both the world and market felt was immediate. Zombies were in vogue, and a video game that can invoke real fear from slow-moving but deadly zombies was exactly what the public was wanting. Resident Evil didn't have to rely on jump scares to get you scared. Threats were oftentimes rather slow-moving. With a combination of the controls and a slow-moving monster, you had a sense of dread that had you stumbling to make sure you shot that zombie before it was too late. IGN was calling Resident Evil 1 a masterpiece, and it was quickly becoming the best-selling game on the PlayStation 1. Resident Evil really put the horror video game genre on the map, inspiring countless other similar titles. A sequel, Resident Evil 2, came 2 years later in '98. This title sold even better than the previous one, 4.96 million copies, and personally was my first Resident Evil game ever played. Resident Evil 2 also didn't struggle to be as successful as its predecessor. It was a direct upgrade in technical aspects, and the story and the world were still that same scary, ominous, slow-creeping death, just more ambitious, which included branching storylines for both playable characters. A common theme in both Resident Evil games was to feature large monsters and boss fights, which would certainly be taken to the limit in the following sequel. Shinji, with his new promotion to producer at Capcom, would oversee both Resident Evil 2 and its sequel Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis would launch just 1 year later in '99, selling over 3.5 million copies. Nemesis was a slight departure from previous titles, as it had more of a focus on the action-oriented gameplay later associated with the Resident Evil franchise. Where the story of this Death of a Game episode really picks up, however, is in September of 2001. Resident Evil 4 rumors were around and about, and the rumors also included a possible ability for them to have an online multiplayer component to their game. The same year at E3, Sony announced their push towards online technologies on the PS2. This was making the rumors about an online-able Resident Evil game that much realer. The first real news concerning a Resident Evil Online game would be dubbed Resident Evil Outbreak, developed not by Mikami's Studio 4, but instead Capcom's Production Studio 1 of Monster Hunter and Devil May Cry fame. Resident Evil Outbreak 1 would be teased by Capcom at E3 2002, showcasing a short trailer highlighting Raccoon City and zombies, aka its Resident Evil. What little was shown had GameSpot suggesting it would be much of the same experiences offered in Resident Evil 1 through 3, except with the added multiplayer component. The first of the multiplayer-focused Resident Evil games to launch was Resident Evil Outbreak 1, and it launched in December 11th, 2003 in Japan and on March 31st, 2004 in the US. Reviews overall for Capcom's first foray with Resident Evil into the multiplayer space was relatively positive according to an aggregate review site, Metacritic. IGN in their review of Outbreak pointed out that although the game didn't have the same formal story from a Resident Evil game, it did allow for play for multiple characters, each with their own history and backgrounds. However, as IGN later states, the lack of meaningful story in an adventure game serves as a detriment to the overall game experience. That being said, the variance in gameplay offered with multiple characters playable still was quite a new and fresh addition to the Resident Evil formula. Where Resident Evil Outbreak doesn't get smashing reviews is in part due to the kind of just being enough to satisfy the previous expectations of the Resident Evil fanbase. Simply adding an online component for many reviewers and fans alike wasn't enough to make the game quality, especially when compared to the previous Resident Evil games or the other multiplayer games on the market at the time. The most controversial aspect of Outbreak was the ad-lib system, where you could select commands using the menu system. Capcom stated that they chose the system over a conventional microphone chat system because they argued that it would ruin the atmosphere of the game.
No kidding.
To be fair, giving players the ability to chat with each other in a horror online game does lessen some of the horror aspects.
Why is your head up my ass?
It also, however, made interactions with other players even more complicated to navigate, and when pressed for time and possibly being chased by a brain-eating zombie, it could lead to a frustrating experience.
Kiss my ass, bitch!
Still, Outbreak cultivated a cult following, due to the many unlockables and hidden Easter eggs in the game. This is arguably the main focus of Outbreak. Whether through collecting costumes, bonus cutscenes, new music, or whatever else you could possibly find, there's a lot of fun and silly reasons to replay the limited amount of missions in Outbreak. With only 5 missions or scenarios in Outbreak, content certainly was a bit sparse. Even with the unlockables, players were bound to be bored over time. Long loading screens taking dozens of seconds only added to the frustration of playing the same levels over and over again. In a game about horror and working together, there's only so many times you can run the same scenarios over and over again and feel actual fear. Outbreak managed to sell 1.45 million copies. Not bad for a game considered to be more of the same with multiplayer for the zombie franchise's first attempt. Success was so much for Outbreak that Capcom announced a sequel dubbed Resident Evil Outbreak File No. 2. Resident Evil Outbreak File No. 2 launched on September 9th, 2004 as a standalone expansion to the original Outbreak in Japan, and on April 26th, 2005 in the US. The launch of the US version of the game would come after the launch of the Japanese version of the long-rumored and long-awaited Resident Evil 4. We could have a whole entire section dedicated to explaining Resident Evil 4, its diversion from the typical Resident Evil gameplay mode and focus for starters, or maybe even its impact on the market at large. There's plenty of videos that wax poetic about that game, and the way it pioneered the use of the over-the-shoulder third-person gameplay style, but also how it relied far more on precise aiming than required by the zombie series, up to that point at least. From just watching a few seconds of Resident Evil 4's gameplay, it's quite obvious that Capcom had made massive leaps in tech. Outbreak File 2 launching smack dab in the middle of Resident Evil 4, one of the better-selling RE games of all time, but also one of the most impactful horror games of all time, certainly wasn't doing the game any favors. Likely in part 2, Outbreak File No. 2 was taken less favorably by critics overall when compared to its predecessor. IGN in their review pointed out that File No. 2 still suffers from that exact same problems that plagued their 2004 effort, which makes it a lot harder to forgive a full year later. The analog-powered variation of old-school configuration used since the series' inception is really starting to wear thin, especially after playing Capcom's near-flawless GameCube sequel, Resident Evil 4. The original 8 characters were present in Outbreak File No. 2, accompanied by 5 new story scenarios. A fully priced game by Capcom was yet again facing an issue of not having enough content to sustain a long enough online multiplayer player base to keep their multiplayer game alive. File number 2 simply looked and felt dated already, when compared to the newly minted Resident Evil 4, which was already smashing record books. Outbreak 2 is rumored to have sold 40% of what its predecessor did. This is only just 500,000 based on my estimation. Capcom would choose not to further pursue a multiplayer-centric Resident Evil game due to this performance, and wouldn't for some time. Capcom would also shut down the servers for Outbreak File number 2 in 2007, just 2 years after the launch. Capcom's attempt at a multiplayer-focused Resident Evil game was certainly not panning out to be as successful as they might have hoped. This explains the near 5-year period of no multiplayer Resident Evil game launching. As Capcom proved with Resident Evil 4, a change of scenery for the aging series was needed for the game to adapt to the times. Perhaps it was time for the model behind the multiplayer games to also shift from being that Resident Evil 1 to 3 style. With the original creator Shinji Mikami and his studio not involved anymore, however, it was starting to seem like quite the tall task. Capcom wouldn't return to a Resident Evil multiplayer game until they launched Operation Raccoon City in the spring of 2012. Instead of utilizing the previous production Studio 1, Capcom would enlist in the help of an outside developer, Slant 6 Games, of SOCOM US Navy SEALs notoriety. Slant 6 Games was certainly an interesting choice for a developer, as they had no prior experience with Resident Evil and were largely an American company. Having a history of making the average received SOCOM Navy SEALs games wasn't exactly the portfolio that Resident Evil fans were expecting when they heard the announcement of a new multiplayer title in the Resident Evil universe, nearly 7 years after the last one. Taking some inspiration from Resident Evil 4 and 5 respectively, Operation Raccoon City focused heavily on the action and shooter aspects of gameplay. With a third-person perspective, you picked one of the 12 playable characters, 6 for the USS, the Umbrella Security Service, and 6 for the Echo 6 campaigns. Strangely, however, you could only play 4 of these characters online. The player in Operation Raccoon City plays the role of a cleanup crew Umbrella Corp member, sent there to exterminate the remaining zombie threats, the first time in the Resident Evil franchise that you play an evil character. As PC Gamer put in their review concerning ORC, unfortunately, your opponents are the all-new Delta team, and they're generic nobodies playing second fiddle to a cast of unsatisfying cameos. Classes offer some unique powers, but the teamwork is no more sophisticated than stick together, don't hog the ammo, and if you're going to use a first aid spray, do it together so everyone gets some. The first part of the statement is kind of a joke about the poor AI present in Operation Raccoon City, frankly speaking a recurring theme in these titles discussed. Concerning the story and atmosphere in Operation Raccoon City, or rather the lack of, PC Gamer said, "The story is functional, and certainly not good or important enough to be forced on you. It's no coincidence that Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasures Service shares an abbreviation with unskippable bloody cutscenes. On top of that, the sound design is positively deflating. You can't take a gun seriously when it sounds like someone is making popcorn, and only the zombies and Spec Op enemies seem to have being hit animations. Shooting larger enemies is profoundly unsatisfying." Many users echoed the same comments, stating that shooting a target in the head in ORC seemed pointless when monsters could just bullet sponge insane amounts. In a game where ammo is and supposed to be scarce, it seems quite strange to have a shooter gameplay that kind of contradicts that. Operation Raccoon City also featured a competitive multiplayer, which, yeah, I'll let that do the talking. Scoring a 48 out of 100 on aggregate review site Metacritic and being even lower rated by the players, Operation Raccoon City was still able to sell 2.5 million copies regardless, which as typical for a Capcom title would surely mean yet another multiplayer title for Resident Evil was certainly planned in the future. How was it that Capcom was still willing to do more multiplayer-focused Resident Evil titles, even when with each subsequent launch the games were being more poorly received? The money was still strong enough to warrant their continued push towards a multiplayer title though, and not likely the passion. The brand recognition of Resident Evil was certainly strong, but could it continue to take such negative blows with each subsequent multiplayer iteration? No passion has to be the only possible explanation for the last and final Resident Evil multiplayer title we will cover in this video. Capcom would announce Umbrella Corps in the fall of 2015. Utilizing their main Osaka studio, Capcom would be handling both developing and publishing on the title. Capcom released a statement concerning details about the title. Umbrella Corps aims to provide a deep, concentrated multiplayer shooter experience like those offered by contemporary esports. This title packs in classic Resident Evil gameplay elements such as menacing zombie hordes. We've stripped away excessive theatricality and constant respawning and pruned away the story elements. Resident Evil suddenly was trying to appeal to a completely new audience, one that already had rather polished and formidable competitors in. Early impressions on Umbrella Corps were certainly not garnering much faith. Polygon called the game mini Counter-Strike with zombies, and yes, I know there's the meme with Polygon and shooters, but they also highlighted how clunky the movement in Umbrella Corps felt. Umbrella Corps officially launched on June 21st, 2016. It's a bit hard to be neutral here as well, considering Umbrella Corps was smashed on aggregate review website Metacritic, scoring a 36 out of 100. Critics were as brazen to say that the game would be dead on arrival. Polygon said, "It's hard to imagine anyone beyond the most die-hard Resident Evil fans picking this game up, and even they will likely leave feeling ripped off. Umbrella Corps feels like a cheap, soulless fan service in a tactical action package." User reviews weren't any better, and this much was seen before the game launched by judging the like-to-dislike ratio on most of the Umbrella Corps videos. Popular YouTube reviewer GamerRanks referred to the game as a free-to-play looking title, and the top comments on his video were littered with comments such as, "Is this an iPhone game?" Some users even commented on a gameplay video of Umbrella Corps, wondering why someone would even put themselves through the torture that is playing the game itself. It's hard not to be opinionated about Umbrella Corps. The game looks and plays like an Unreal Engine mod, and yet features both the Resident Evil name and Capcom's backing as both a developer and a publisher. With a $30 price tag as a downloadable game, the level of polish expected of such a price was nowhere to be found with Umbrella Corps. Instead of seeming like Capcom was learning from past mistakes, they were seemingly creating newer, far worse mistakes. With Outbreak 1 and 2, you had a serviceable idea that was simply falling out of favor due to aging tech and a limited communication system. There was surely some good in those titles. Operation Raccoon City was a failed attempt at capitalizing on the zombie horde killing success of Left 4 Dead. The game vaguely seemed Resident Evil and was unable to outshine Valve's mega hit. Umbrella Corps, however, was a game that very likely shouldn't have made it past the finish line. The poor quality of the game certainly has hurt the multiplayer reputation of Resident Evil even further, begging the question, what reputation was even left? With a new Resident Evil multiplayer title on the horizon, and not yet fully named Project Resistance, looking to be like previous Resident Evil titles, draw inspiration from other popular and currently working gameplay models. Project Resistance seems to be the Capcom Resident Evil answer to Dead by Daylight and the Friday 13th game. Games that are less about combat and more about working together with 4 players in an attempt to escape the ever-present threat of the killer or killers. Instead of talking about what Project Resistance could be though, let's finish outlining the largest reasons for Capcom's repeated failures to adapt the Resident Evil franchise to the multiplayer crowd. We've covered the history thus far of Resident Evil franchise multiplayer titles. Instead of individually breaking out the reasons for their failure, because of the patterns exhibited in all 4 titles, I believe I can talk about all of their failures collectively. A recurring theme throughout this video has sort of been the implication that perhaps Capcom is primarily using the name brand recognition to be the major selling point of their multiplayer efforts. What are the largest reasons Capcom was unable to have lasting success as originally planned with Resident Evil's foray into the multiplayer world? Resident Evil multiplayer suffered from the design problems of added multiplayer, resulting in the horror aspects being lessened, which took away from the overall zombie killing experience. Multiplayer Resident Evil titles lacked the backing and polish of a full-fledged single-player title. That much can be seen and felt. Resident Evil Outbreak 1 and 2 were simply too slow-moving in an ever-innovating market, while Operation Raccoon City and Umbrella Corps were simply inferior products when compared to the market standards, like Left 4 Dead, which they often tried to emulate. All 4 of the Resident Evil titles were lacking in content. Keeping a multiplayer audience without enough content is a tough ask. The shift from Resident Evil being an adventure horror game to a more action-oriented game has shown that Capcom is behind in terms of shooters and their polish overall, at least on the multiplayer front. Capcom certainly has made some mistakes in their journey to bring Resident Evil to the multiplayer stage. Still, you can't deny that Resident Evil Outbreak had its odd charm. Resident Evil has had success with attempting the cooperative formula in both Resident Evil Revelations and Resident Evil 5. That certainly could have been something further explored. What won't work for the franchise anymore, however, as abundantly apparent, is rushed and unpolished projects attempting to capitalize on the shooter market and being a Resident Evil themed game. Whatever the future holds for Resident Evil's attempt at multiplayer, one thing is for absolutely certain. With the recent great success of Resident Evil 7 and the remake of Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil as a franchise period is not going anywhere. Just like the zombies that keep somehow reanimating themselves in the game. Thanks for watching, guys.
Shit time.